No. Waters. Oh, that's fine. Don't worry. Sorry, don't worry, mate. Good morning, colleagues. Can I ask you to take your seats? That was, I don't know, good effect. Good morning, colleagues. Can I ask you to take your seats? Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Can I welcome you all to this meeting of the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. Welcome to Rochdale. Thank you to Councillor Brett and the team here for hosting us today. Item 1, apologies. We have apologies from Tony Oakman, Chief Executive of Bolton, Nikki Bishop attending in Tony's place. From Jim Taylor, Chief Executive of Salford, Ben Dolan attending in his place, and from Stephen Pleasant, and we have Sandra Stewart attending for Stephen. Item 2, Chair's announcements, just two to make briefly. The first is, colleagues may have seen the news earlier this week that Greater Manchester has been shortlisted for the location for a new base for Channel 4 alongside Birmingham and Leeds. This is obviously very welcome news, and we'd like to thank the Channel 4 board, congratulate the team at Manchester City Council, Salford City Council and at the GMCA who have been working on this today. We will now obviously take those discussions forward to the next level, but some positive news, and I thought colleagues would want to know about that. The second item to update you on is that I've got a new job. Don't get too excited, because it's unpaid and in my spare time, and it means I won't be leaving this job. But unlike this one, at least it comes with a chain as President of the Rugby Football League. So I will obviously want to use that position to promote the great sport of Rugby League in Greater Manchester, and of course to make sure that we welcome the Rugby Football League to Greater Manchester as they move their headquarters here, and also to ensure that the Rugby League World Cup 2021, the Greater Manchester plays a big part in that, and I'm sure that will have all of colleagues' support behind it. Item 3, declarations of interest, if they could be completed in the normal way, please. Item 4, minutes of the GMCA annual and ordinary meetings held on the 29th of June. Are they approved? Thank you, colleagues. Item 5, appointments. We're being asked to consider the appointment of Councillor Alison Gwyn from Tameside as Chair of the Waste and Recycling Committee for 2018, as nominated by the committee on the 12th of July. Is that approved, colleagues? Thank you. Secondly, to approve the appointment of Councillor Robin Garrido from Salford as a member of the GMCA Waste and Recycling Committee. Approved? Thank you. GMCA Audit Committee, we're being asked to appoint 2 substitute members, 1 Labour, 1 Conservative, to the committee from the pool of nominations. The nominations include only 1 Conservative, so I'm taking it that that individual is automatically approved. That's Councillor James Grundy from Wigan. So that's approved. Thank you. And the proposed second substitute member, Councillor Susan Howarth from Bolton. Approved? Thank you very much. Next, GMCA Overview and Scrutiny Committee substitutes. We have two from Oldham, Clint, I forget his name right, Fythion, have I got that right? Fythion, oh my goodness, right. Apologies to Clint when you see him, Sean. And from Salford, Ari Leitner. Are they approved? Thank you very much. Item 6, TFGM Committee Minutes, 13th of July, to be noted. Item 7, Greater Manchester Local Enterprise Partnership, 16th of July, the same, are they noted? Item 8, GMCA Waste and Recycling Committee, also to be noted. Thank you, colleagues. Item 9, GMCA Overview and Scrutiny Committee Minutes, Housing, Planning and Environment of 12th of July, Economy, Business, Growth and Skills of 13th of July, to be noted. Thank you, colleagues. Item 10, Fire Service Update. This week, the Deputy Mayor and I visited Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service Training Centre to update since the Kerslake report, when we commissioned a root and branch review into Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service, which colleagues will remember. Since that time, the Deputy Mayor and I have visited 37 fire stations in Greater Manchester to have an open and frank discussion with frontline staff. And though it has been a major time commitment on our behalf, we both feel that it has been time very, very well spent indeed, and has begun, we believe, a process of change for the better in Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service. Of course, you know, the Kerslake report was a difficult moment for our fire service, we all know that. But 4 months on, I was able to go back this week and congratulate the frontline staff and the team that supported them on the outstanding work that was done on Saddleworth Moor, and of course at Winter Hill in support of Lancashire Fire and Rescue Service. Two simultaneous major incidents handled with great skill, dedication and professionalism, and I think it brought back over to the Greater Manchester public the strength and the value of their fire service, and they are rightly very, very proud of them. And from there we can now build, I believe, to a stronger future. So I want to introduce the Deputy Mayor to talk to the latest with regard to the review.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, apologies to members that we've had to table this report today. That's because we couldn't finalise it until yesterday because of very late developments this week, including securing a formal agreement from the Fire Brigade Union for some of the changes we wanted to announce, and also confirming the appointment of a new Chief Fire Officer mentioned in the report, Jim Wallace, who has most recently been the Chief Executive and Accountable Officer for Northern Ireland Fire and Rescue Service, where he oversaw a very kind of similar transformational programme of change there, and previously worked in Scotland to bring together a range of separate fire services into a single service for Scotland. So we think he's got some experience that will be very, very important for us going forward. The report summarises briefly the approach we've taken and the progress that we have achieved so far. I think it's really important to emphasise what the Mayor has said, that the visits we're doing, whilst time-consuming, are really important, not only because they're giving us insight into the issues in the fire service at a level of detail I think we wouldn't otherwise get, and all of that information and insight is being fed into the programme board and is informing the work programme. But secondly, it's also, I think, building support for the process of change itself, and that will be very important, particularly later on when we address some of the perhaps more difficult issues we'll have to look at further down the line. Broadly, the approach we have taken is listen, learn and change, and those meetings are really important for the listening and the learning phases. They're also informing our approach to change, to the extent that we thought it was important to be seen early on, not to wait till all these meetings are finished, because there's some way to go yet, but early on to signal the kind of approach we're taking with changes that we could make early that we felt people would welcome. So whilst this is a whole service review and it will take some time to complete, nonetheless we were able to announce some important measures this week, and I'll get to those in a minute. The appendix at the end gives you the governance structure. There's a programme board supported by a programme team, which comprises not only officers from the Combined Authority, but officers from other partner organisations, as well as some external expertise. The board is chaired by the Chief Executive of the Combined Authority, and that reports to a steering group which consists of the Mayor and myself. There are 6 work streams to cover the whole range of issues, looking at the operating model, looking at emergency response, what should that be, looking at prevention, being more focused on fire prevention activities, I think, protection, business support, what is a reasonable level of back office function, and how do we get there, and of course addressing some of the organisational leadership and cultural issues that were raised particularly in the Kerslake report. In terms of progress to date then, as well as establishing that architecture and bedding it in, we've announced this week some important things I think that will be welcomed. The interim overtime agreement that the Mayor announced in December, using some of the budgetary underspend to bring back overtime as a way of mitigating some of the effects of the significant number of vacancies in the operational front line. That's been extended, and we've got agreement with the FBU now ready to go. And in addition, we've got an accelerated recruitment programme to address that issue of vacancies. I think 2 particular things that we've been able to change quickly, announced this week, is changing the shift duty system, which I won't go into detail about, but this was a source of considerable contention and causing great difficulty for firefighters, meaning that they actually couldn't be sure on their rest days or on their weekend off that they'd actually not be called in. So we've completely changed that system to a more traditional 2-2-4 shift pattern from the 1st of September. And I think that will be very welcome. Again, the FBU have agreed and drawn up a formal collective agreement on that, on which they will consult in the next few weeks, and we're hoping if that goes to plan, we can bring in that shift duty system from the 1st of September. Similarly, annual leave. This was a situation in which firefighters had no choice at all when their annual leave was. They were simply told when it would be. No kind of family-friendly considerations at all. We can't change that in year because the leave's been determined, but from next April there will be new policy in which firefighters will have a considerable degree of choice, and it will be resolved at local level. We've also, in our visits, uncovered a range of kind of serious but practical issues, such as the condition of some of the fire stations. Chadderton was actually worse, and so we've brought forward a programme to rectify the really serious issues in the very bad working environment there. Lack of female facilities at a considerable number of fire stations. Again, programme of work to rectify that is underway. And general issues of maintenance and compliance with health and safety issues was poorly monitored and poorly complied with, and again that's been brought forward because clearly it's urgent. There's work beginning on the vision and the organisational issues at leadership level, and we've also established a staff reference group to sit alongside the programme board and at every step of the way both comment on and feed into the proposals that are being developed, because we're very, very clear that this process of change has to be informed by and reflect the views of people on the front line, not just firefighters, but other people. And it's very important that to us that the programme is conducted in that way. The Mayor has described it as moving from a back office first regime to a frontline first regime, and I think that generally sums up the way we're going here. So there's a brief summary. I'm happy to take any questions that members may have.
Thank you very much indeed. Bev, would anybody like to raise any questions or comments? If not, I would just like to thank Donna Hall, Chief Executive of Wigan Council.
Thanks, Andy. I think it's really good, great work, Bev, well done. I was just wondering whether, because fire in Wigan are really instrumental in our place-based teams, and whether we could introduce a kind of element of place-based working as part of the organisational development programme, so that making sure that all stations are connected into their place-based teams.
That's very much our intention. You know, part of, whilst Slate was instrumental in kind of catalysing the review, it was also going to be necessary anyway because of the fire service coming into the combined authority and looking at how the real integration at a place-based level could be much improved. So focusing on protection and prevention around those areas is where we hope to achieve that, Donna.
Anybody else? If not, can I, on everybody's behalf, thank the Deputy Mayor for the excellent work she's done in leading this process following the Kerslake report. We are making real progress. Just to reiterate the point, I did say to the meeting this week of staff and others that I want the organisation to embody that frontline first culture in everything that it does. People in this room, people who serve in management positions, are there to support the frontline, and that is our responsibility. And actually that's a principle that should apply across all, and indeed does apply across other Greater Manchester public services, but we want the fire service to embody this now in everything that it does. I would just want to place on record my welcome to Jim Wallace, who will be joining us as the new Chief Fire Officer. But in doing so, I want to pay tribute to Dawn Docks, who served as Interim Chief in the period throughout the early part of this year, through the Kerslake report, until now, and when Jim takes over. It was a very difficult situation to come into as someone newly appointed to Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service around this time last year. But at that difficult moment, Dawn showed great leadership in steadying the ship, and I think we all today need to put on record our sincere thanks to Dawn for the work that she has done to ensure that Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service is now on an upward path, and that is due in no small part to you, Dawn. So thank you very much. Okay, moving on to item 11, Health and Social Care bi-monthly update. Lord Peter Smith.
Okay, thank you. There's obviously the written report, and I'll go through key points and then take any questions anybody might have. Afterwards, item 1 is the same. We've just published our annual report, and it shows that there is a significant change across GM. We are beginning to work in smaller service delivery areas with across GP working and working properly through communities, which I think is the best way forward. We're trying to change the model of health towards one that's more treating it as a health service rather than simply a sickness or ill health service. We're still operating a kind of multi-speed system in GM, though, of course, because it's being worked through in localities. Not everywhere is as fast as everywhere else, but hopefully we're all getting in the right direction, and we will be pushing a bit harder, I think, with the ones that are a bit slower. We're now actually in the third year of devolution, and so we need to think what we're going to do in the future, and particularly with the comprehensive spending review that's coming up in the autumn. So we're re-examining the model again, just to make sure we thought taking charge, which was our first plan, is more or less robust still, and we've confirmed at our meeting yesterday, really, that the whole of the partnership executive agreed that we're really on a public service reform agenda. We can't neglect the pressures within the NHS. We'll come back to it in a moment, but nevertheless, I think that if we're going to achieve the objectives we have, it's going to come through public service reform, and we want to play an even bigger role in the work that's done across GM, because clearly it is something we need to do together rather than separate chunks. Primary care is beginning to reform, and again, you can see an improvement in the services, so people can now get to 7-day services, more evening services, which obviously is good. And as I say, in many areas, the GPs are now working with service delivery areas, which helps. GM's always had a really good record in terms of its cancer services, but unfortunately not a good record in terms of diagnosis. We were late diagnosis in many cases, which obviously it's not good in the form of cancer. So we're trying to beef up that diagnosis and work with all that. So that's the base of the cancer strategy, and again, it's beginning to show some fruit. Digital is obviously going to be the way forward, so we need to, we understand from yesterday that there won't be quite as much money from the digital pot nationally as we'd hope there'll be, but maybe we need to rethink how we fund some of that, and if it's going to be so important to improve our digital base, then using some of the funding that many local authorities are capital rich, if not revenue rich, and it may be a way, if we can invest in some digital services, it actually starts to cut costs. Item 6 covers the various important performance standards. As colleagues will know, the winter period has been particularly challenging for the NHS for a number of reasons, but basically it's because, again, it's the system which concentrates simply on treating people when they're ill and elderly rather than trying to do enough prevention. So the standards dropped and they got back again to a better level, but of course they're being challenged at the moment by the hot weather, the extreme hot weather that's affecting many of the population. Again, we want to improve all these other towns. Cancer slipped in 1 or 2 places, and we will be keeping our eye on that. Item 7 covers the work we're doing in population health with many of the GM initiatives. We're pleased to announce the funding we got from Sport England, 10 million, just over 10 million, to help us to get things moving in that direction. We're obviously working with Chris Boardman and his team to make sure we get that activity up. But again, these are going to be probably a long-term. We don't expect to see short-term gains here. It's going to be a longer-term thing. For those who were at the partnership meeting a couple of weeks ago, there was a very moving presentation on our learning disability strategy. More moving because it was presented by people who have learning disabilities who contributed to the actual strategy. And within the strategy, we had carers reporting to us some of the issues that they face, which was, again, very helpful. But I was particularly shocked, I think, with one bit of news, which I thought we could do a lot better on, is that nationally, about 7% of people with learning disabilities are in employment, which seems to be shockingly low, but that's it. But in GM, it was just above 3%. And I think the way that we work together, we ought to do better. So I'm going to personally take an interest in that area. I've talked to Eamon. I'll obviously work with the lead that you've appointed, Andy, in skills, and the chief exec lead, I think we need a good database on this, and then see what we can do, work through best practice to try and get more people with disabilities, because obviously it raises the dignity and status if we can achieve that. I think many of us are not concerned about the health offer for young people. It's not as good as it should be, and particularly in terms of mental health support. So again, part of our mental health strategy is to drive that up. CAMS across GM is perhaps not a great service. We're beginning to work on joint strategies for adult social care, and some of our health partners want us to do and identify what service they can expect, as well as we expect service of them, what do they expect from us. So we're beginning to work on that, and I'm going to be calling soon a meeting for the leads across the 10 authorities on adult social care. Over the page on item 11, theme 3, remember this is the one that's looking at the acute sector, where we want to try and get both an improvement in the quality of hospital services across GM, but also in a sense it's going to be, hospital treatment is the most expensive, so we want to make sure it's only done as and when necessary. So we're beginning now to use a clinical approach to see what the new service models might be across GM. It lists the various areas that people are working on. Some have come through, some, not all yet. But then when they've come through, there'll need to be some pretty important decisions, political decisions, about what we do in future. So that's where the Joint Commissioning Board will come in. So we had the discussion at the Leaders Away Day and agreed that this ought to be a more political activity, and we'll get some political involvement in the Joint Commissioning Board in the near future. And then leaders will be able to understand what's going on, and there'll be some interesting but difficult decisions to make, but at least you'll be informed and you'll understand why. And that's about it, really, so take any questions.
Thank you very much, Peter, for a comprehensive report. Particularly want to thank you for taking up the issue around adults with learning disabilities in employment. It is shockingly low, as you say, and your personal leadership on that important issue with Councillor Sean Fielding will be very much to be welcomed, I'm sure, by everybody. I don't know if Chief Officer or anybody else would want to comment on any item raised by Peter. If not, could I just say that this was a significant month for the health service in Greater Manchester, in that we commemorated the visit of the great Nye Bevan to what was then called Park Hospital, now Trafford General, in July 1948, to give, as I say, the greatest gift the British people have ever been given, the National Health Service, and it was a truly memorable occasion, organised with the help of Central Manchester Foundation Trust, but of course the partnership as well. I think Peter's summary is right. We've done some of the structural back office changes to now enable our health service to move forward in the integrated direction that we all want to see, and the commissioning arrangements have been changed to reflect that. I think that we need to be quite proud that devolution is already making a real difference. Peter mentioned children's services, and particularly child and adolescent mental health services. The pilot that the partnership have introduced into GM schools on children's mental health, I think, is very exciting and answers a real need as expressed to us by our own youth combined authority. And I wonder whether Peter or John could update the main combined authority at some point on the findings from that pilot, because I think there is a real call out there for better mental health support for our young people, and the schools-based independent service, I think, offers real encouragement and hope for the future, and I think I would welcome a fuller report back on that at a future meeting. Just a couple of final points to make. When he visited Trafford General, Nye Bevan was Minister of State for Housing and Health. And I always remind people that there is obviously a clear connection between those two things. Without good housing, there is no good health. And that's very much true in terms of our work with rough sleeping. One night out on the streets damages not just your physical health, but perhaps more importantly, people's mental health. And we have to work to bring back the connection between those two things in public policy terms that, quite frankly, has been lost over the years. And that is an opportunity of devolution. I was very interested that John and his team have looked across Greater Manchester at the potential need for supported housing in the coming period. And I think a figure of around 15,000 has been identified. I've certainly asked for that to be played into the spatial framework process, because I do think if we had to introduce here a new model of 21st century healthcare that starts at home, then I do think we need to think about building homes as places where care will be delivered. And I think that's a very important development. Similarly, an event we held last week around social prescribing, touching on the points Peter made about physical activity. How can we have a primary care service in Greater Manchester that doesn't think of medication as the default offer, but signposts people towards the support that will help them regain control of their health and of their lives? And I think, again, that development is a real sign of devolution making a difference, of Greater Manchester charting a path towards a 21st century NHS that isn't simply a medical treatment service, but is about health promotion in all its senses. So I think there's real signs of change on the horizon. I want to congratulate you, Peter and John, for the work that both of you and all of the team at the Health and Care Partnership are doing. It is exciting, and we all look forward to working with you to take it forward. Thank you very much. Item 12, Greater Manchester Spatial Framework Timetable. Mayor Paul Dennett.
Thanks, Chair. This is an update on the proposed timetable for the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework, following obviously the recent decision at the last combined authority to delay the consultation until October. In terms of just responding to the point you made there around supported housing or supported accommodation, obviously we see that as critical to the work of the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework, also the work of the local districts across Greater Manchester in terms of their local plans, but also the forthcoming housing strategy for Greater Manchester. The combined authority today are being asked to agree the proposed approach, and as colleagues will know, we recently had the subnational population projections predicting slower growth in population between 2016 and 36, with a projected growth of 240,000 people over 20 years. And as you can see from the paper, there are variations across the 10 districts of Greater Manchester. We're currently waiting for the subnational housing projections, which will be produced by the Office of National Statistics in September. But at this stage, we can't fully predict what the relationship between the SNPP and the SNHP actually is, which made it prudent for us to obviously wait till October to launch the next consultation. And obviously information is vital in terms of understanding housing need across Greater Manchester within the spatial framework and also our local plans. The Office of National Statistics, as you can see in the report, recently published a methodology also for calculating the subnational housing projections. Just want to draw members' attention to the fact that we did collaborate in that consultation, and you can access the GMCA's submission to that. Today, obviously, we're agreeing the timetable, and as you can see within the report, the consultation draft is to be approved in October 2018, with 12 weeks consultation taking place between November and January. Then the draft plan is approved in July 2019, with further consultation and representation between August and October 2019. That then takes us on to the submission plan to be approved in December 2019, January 2020, with examination in public over the summer of 2020. And then the final publication will be adopted in the winter of 2020-21. So that's the timetable that we're all agreeing to. One thing I would like to obviously draw attention to as well is that in principle we are being asked to make a decision on the move from a joint development plan process to a spatial development strategy, subject to obviously the regulations being agreed. The other thing on communications, because obviously from the first consultation we know the absolute importance of effectively communicating and engaging the residents across Greater Manchester and stakeholders. Just to draw your attention to the fact that we've engaged Citizen Space, which is a new platform which makes this consultation in October accessible across all mobile devices. And obviously user experience is really at the heart of all of that. So we've obviously procured a new platform for us to maximise engagement across Greater Manchester with the next consultation that will start in October. Happy to take any questions on the proposed paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. Any colleagues like to come in on this item, raise any questions or issues? Councillor Andrew Weston.
Thanks, Andy. Just very briefly, to welcome the proposed use of citizen space. I think it's absolutely imperative for us that we do everything we can to engage with the residents of Greater Manchester, particularly learning the lessons that were at the first time round. And particularly welcome the way that the platform will be set up to enable people to engage with as much or as little of it as possible. I think it's absolutely the right way forward, and I'm really, really pleased to see that that's the proposal.
I think it's possibly an understatement to say that the communications left room for improvement first time around, and we obviously want to make sure that we improve that this time, but also improve the quality of the conversation and the consultation with the public. So I think you're absolutely right, Andrew, to mention that, and Paul is right to have brought in this platform that will hopefully facilitate that higher quality exchange. Any other colleagues want to come in on this item? If not, can I thank colleagues and thank you, Paul. It's been right to take the extra time. I don't think anybody in Greater Manchester would thank us for rushing ahead on the wrong figures. The need is to get this plan right for the long term. But now that we've got this revised timetable, I think it is clear that we need to press on and deliver to this new timetable. And I'm sure all colleagues will help Paul and myself in making sure that happens. So thank you very much, Paul. Item 13, Greater Manchester Local Industrial Strategy Update. Sir Richard Lees.
Thanks, Chair. This, of course, dates back to last year's budget, where the government agreed with us that we would pilot a local industrial strategy to sit alongside the national industrial strategy. That national industrial strategy is based on the 5 foundations and 4 grand challenges that are identified in this report, and obviously the local industrial strategy has to mirror those. I don't think that's a problem, in that they are the grand challenges are all things that are important to us anyway, and the 5 foundations are all areas that are clearly identified within the Greater Manchester strategy. It is intended to be a long-term strategy to 2030. Clearly we'll need some revision between now and 2030, but I think it does give us an opportunity to set out for the economy of Greater Manchester not only how we want it to grow over that period of time, but what we need to do to make it grow as well. As an interim stage, we are due to release a joint statement with government any time now. The text of the statement is largely agreed. I think we're just waiting for a date for that to be released, which sets out progress to date, but also identifies 2 of the grand challenges, ageing society and clean growth, and particularly energy related to clean growth, where we can make early progress ahead of having a final version of the local industrial strategy. February next year is when we expect to sign that off. The major piece of work we're doing is around the evidence gathering, and you'll see in the report around section 3 that we've gathered together a group of people who have real credibility to oversee a review of the evidence base, and that they have commissioned, set out in 3.6, a series of research pieces of work to toughen up that evidence base. We know, going back 10 years to the Manchester Independent Economic Review, that if we have a robust evidence base that is genuinely independent, then in terms of our ability to have meaningful discussions, not just with government, with other players as well, is greatly enhanced. So I think that update of the evidence base is going to be very, very important. Paper also touches on the Strength in Places Fund. Further to the paper, I can report that on Wednesday of this week, University of Manchester submitted a bid to the Strength in Places Fund based on health innovation and advanced materials, and that's supported very widely, hopefully successful. It's a two-stage process, and the first stage is bidding for 50,000 and 50,000 to be able to do a more detailed bid for the second stage, but the second stage has certainly the potential of very significant funding to be able to take forward work in that area. Happy to take questions, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. Richard, any questions? Mayor Dennett.
No, I mean, I welcome this report, and it's critical that obviously we plan for our future industries. I guess for me, obviously, thinking about the Strength in Places Fund and the fact that the University of Manchester are leading on that work, it's just a plea really to ensure that we've got engagement across all HE institutions and relevant industries around health, advanced materials and digital, and also that we're playing to some of our key assets within Greater Manchester when obviously we co-design or co-create what will be a local industrial strategy for Greater Manchester, and that we maximise the partnerships and the expertise within our system here in Greater Manchester. It's just a plea for collaboration and partnership.
Although the bid is submitted by the University of Manchester, it is submitted as a consortium, and both University of Salford and Manchester Metropolitan University are deeply embedded into that partnership, as are a range of other players as well.
Just to say that this is a really good opportunity for Greater Manchester. With the uncertainty that's out there, the ability for us to set a clear direction for our economy and industry in the next decade is a big opportunity, and one we must take. But as with all things, we must do it with people rather than do it to people. And Richard's proposing a very detailed process of discussion and stakeholder engagement through the autumn, so that we write a strategy that is widely owned by people across Greater Manchester. The two challenges that have been picked out from the National Industrial Strategy, Ageing Society and Clean Growth, we are of course in a very strong position on both. We've just talked about health devolution and the unique position we have around rethinking 21st century care, and that's an opportunity we must use to the full. But also, of course, the Green Summit and all the work that Councillor Gwyn did earlier this year will pay dividends in helping us adopt a leadership position on the green economy. So we are in a strong position. The one thing I would just add at this stage is we also need, though, to start with the greatest asset when it comes to our economy of Greater Manchester, and that is our people. And I think the work that's being done on young people and skills and life readiness, the work that we are looking at with regard to a Greater Manchester Good Employment Charter, all of that I think needs to sit very squarely at the heart of a strong industrial strategy, because we will only achieve all of our ambitions if we are getting the best from our people, indeed helping our residents achieve the best that they can. So this is an exciting opportunity. Thank you, Richard, for all the work that you've done to put us into this position. We will obviously look with interest at the Strength in Places Fund bid, and we thank Manchester University and Dame Nancy Rothwell for the work that's been done to bring the universities together and the business community behind that. And we will await further developments. But thank you very much indeed, Richard. And I think at this point we'll move swiftly on to the item that you have all been waiting for, that you look out for every month: Brexit Monthly Monitor Update.
A few comments on the paper, Chair. I suppose the big news, of course, is that in July the UK government published its white paper on what they would see the future relationship between the UK and the European Union. Some of the key elements are set out in the paper: common rule book for on goods, basically ending of free trade in services, but very little on something that we've raised on a regular basis, which is very little on the free movement of people. We've also seen that this is not a white paper that's brought universal acclaim. Indeed, even within the ruling party, it's not brought universal acclaim. Although I very much regret that it's a Greater Manchester MP was one of the people who helped the government get a majority on the issue of well, not having a customs union in that case, in that particular case. But it's unclear really as we go forward to see about how government are going to be able to get anything through a parliament where there appears to be no consensus on anything much going forward. The second half of the paper deals with the budget issues for post-2021 when we should have left the European Union. It sets out some of the funding that we've previously been able to access. I think it's fairly clear now that there are some of those programmes like Horizon Europe, which is a successor to Horizon 2020, where it will be possible for the UK to opt into those programmes, and we should be able to continue to benefit. And I think that's really, really important for a number of our growth sectors within Greater Manchester. What's not at all clear is what will replace European structural funding going forward, of which we would expect to get a very significant chunk to replace that lost funding through the Shared Prosperity Fund. As yet, we have no details on the Shared Prosperity Fund, although I understand that government are proposing to issue a consultation paper in September. But it's really, really important as we move forward that we get details of the proposals around Shared Prosperity Fund as early as possible. It's also, we need to make clear that our aspirations for Shared Prosperity Fund, as well as having a quantum that does replace the lost European funding, that it's also on a similar basis to existing structural funds, i.e. it is devolved to Greater Manchester and it's long-term funding. We don't want short-term challenge funds to replace what we've had in the past. Perhaps something that we've not touched on much here, but we ought to have some concern about, is the impact, if there is no deal, on our ability to get around the world, because all of our open skies policies are dependent on Europe, both open sky policy within Europe, but also the bilateral agreements with other parts of the world as well. So our ability to have flights going to the United States is affected by agreements that are through the European Union. And so we have to make sure that alongside everything else, that there is a very clear agreement about how an open skies policy will operate, because if we don't have that, it will be absolutely disastrous for our economy. The last thing I want to say really is that we are in a difficult position. Although we get the regular report, we've not really revisited the policy position of the Combined Authority for some significant period of time. And I think it would be useful to have a report coming to our September meeting that will allow us to review that policy, and particularly there, so it is in advance of the parliamentary vote on the deal, or whatever it happens to be at that time, which again is a vote that we would expect to see in the autumn.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard. A difficult outlook, whichever side of the debate you're coming from, and considerably uncertain as we sit here today. Comments, questions from the floor. John Rouse.
Thank you. I'd just like to ask Richard, when do you think we need to be initiating emergency planning, resilience, response arrangements to prepare for the possibility of a no deal at the Greater Manchester level?
Well, I think the answer to that is now. And government is already doing that, and I think we need to be doing that.
I think we will propose a set of arrangements or advice and guidance. John, I understand that the Health Service is already beginning to think about this as rightly it should, but as we get closer to that possibility, it needs to be perhaps an exercise that all Greater Manchester public bodies need to start thinking about. We'll bring back some more considered advice on that in September. Okay, that's suitably depressed, everybody. So thank you, Richard. Just to iterate the point about European funding, because it does link back to our previous discussion about the local industrial strategy and its hopeful success. Currently, Greater Manchester has been receiving around £100 million a year. Not all from Europe, but that's the European funding plus the match funding that the UK government gives to European funding. So you are right to say that we need to be funded at the same level, but we need to be clear that that's the level that the Shared Prosperity Fund should be aiming for, not simply giving us the European funding and not the element that would traditionally have been matched by the UK government. It does need to be multi-year, as you say. It needs to be flexible. We need to know our arrangements as quickly as possible now, and the September statement from the government needs to answer all of those questions so that we know where we stand and that we can begin to plan for our future. So it's absolutely right to raise this point at this stage, but on your behalf I intend to become more direct with the government on this issue, because we're just 2 years away now and we need to know what funds are at our disposal to start building for the future outside of the European Union. Okay, thank you very much indeed, Richard. Moving on to item 15, the role of cooperatives. Very apt to be having this discussion in the home of the cooperative movement. So I'll hand over to Councillor Alan Brett, leader of Rochdale.
The chair of the Cooperative Council's Innovation Network, Sharon Taylor, plus the chief executive, Nicola Huckabee, and I'm not one for long speeches, so could I just recommend it to you, and we'll hope that you'll all turn up when we have the day.
Thank you very much indeed, Alan. Welcome, Sharon. It's great to see you here today. I don't know if you'd like to add to that. Not much left to add, I don't think, from what Alan said. But if you would like to address the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, we'd be pleased to hear.
I'd just like to say what a great pleasure it is to be back here in Rochdale again and to meet with colleagues of the AGMA group for the first time all together. It's the first time I've ever joined a meeting where you're all together. So Nicola and I are delighted to be here and very much welcome this step regarding cooperatives. And as you say, Mayor Burnham, it's very appropriate that it should take place here in Rochdale, the birthplace of the cooperative movement. The Innovation Network has gone from strength to strength over the last few years, and our authorities it's an action-based network, and our authorities are showing out there every day the difference that the co-op way of doing things can make out there in our communities and with the very people you were talking about in your earlier debates. So thank you very much for inviting us here today.
It's wonderful to see you here, and I need to remind people that I am, of course, the Labour and Cooperative Mayor for Greater Manchester, although I have to say that there were some people in the room who acted as returning officers on the day of my election who proclaimed me the Labour and Conservative candidate for Greater Manchester, which was interesting, but I have to point out I'm the Labour and Cooperative Mayor, and we're very pleased to be confirming our membership today of the Cooperative Council's Innovation Network, and the £500 cheque, I think, is being written somewhere. But I want to thank Alan for the leadership that he and Rochdale Council, also Oldham Council, I think, who are one of our cooperative councils and have played a lead role in building this agenda in GM, Salford as well. Don't want to miss our 3 cooperative councils off the list. I think this goes back again, linking all the dots here to the discussion about the industrial strategy. If we are thinking about a new economy where we're empowering our communities and our people, this agenda around cooperative ownership needs to be very much a part of that as well. So we're joining, I think, at the right time. And Sharon, we look forward to your help in how we might bring forward some innovation and some new thinking in that space. So it's great to have you with us today in the home of the cooperative movement, and we look forward to working with you. Okay, colleagues, moving on to item 16, Green Summit Springboard. Councillor Alex Ganotis.
Thank you. Well, this is probably the most important document that I have put forward since taking on the Green portfolio in June of last year, and I'm putting it forward for your approval to launch today. It's essentially our springboard to where we want to get to in Greater Manchester on the low carbon agenda, and it's the first significant publication that we're putting out since the successful Green Summit in March. At that summit, we launched our ambition to be a leading green city, not just in the UK, but across Europe. And we set out our ambition to become carbon neutral by 2038. And effectively, the summit was very much focused on that date and what it would mean to us and what we would need to do. And this is a substantive piece of work which starts that journey. It recaps the key things that we launched at the Green Summit in March. First of all, it sets out that this is a science-based target of 2038. Through working with the Tyndall Centre at the University of Manchester, we have a scientific calculation which demonstrates that if Greater Manchester is to play its fair share in the Paris Agreement of limiting global temperature rises to no more than 2% on 1990 levels, we need to become carbon neutral by 2038. And importantly, the bulk of those carbon reductions need to take place within the next 10 years. So it's a very, very ambitious target, but one that we think we can achieve with the right approach, and one that is crucial for us to achieve in order to meet the aspirations of our residents, to ensure that people remain and improve healthy lives, to protect the jobs of the future. Essentially, this is about the well-being of the people of Greater Manchester. We've also worked on a project called Scatter, which is BAYS funded, which is a city-wide model, a specific model for Greater Manchester as to how we can become carbon neutral and how we can go about and the steps that we would need to take in different areas to actually achieve that. This document also sets out what people told us in the run-up to the Green Summit. The Green Summit was based on people and people feeding into that. It summarises the views of the more than 1,200 people that took part in Green Summit listening exercises in the run-up to that event. It summarises the feedback we had at the summit itself, attended by over 600 people, and it summarises the expert advice we have been provided as to what we need to do in Greater Manchester to achieve our carbon neutral ambitions. There are 3 broad areas by way of policy that this springboard document sets out. First of all, the work that we are already doing to reduce carbon emissions in Greater Manchester. Secondly, and importantly, the key announcements that we made at the Green Summit itself in terms of what we will deliver for Greater Manchester in this agenda over the next 12 months. And the cover document for this meeting talks in more depth about each of those announcements that we made in March, what we've undertaken so far on each of them, and the work that is still required to be done so that you can hold us to account and measure our progress. And importantly and crucially, it sets out the further work that we need to carry out to develop all the remaining policies and initiatives that we need to do in Greater Manchester to actually achieve that date of carbon neutrality. And this document will lead us up to the Green Summit next year, which I can exclusively announce here will be on the 25th of March at the Lowry. It's going to be a bigger venue than this year because it will be a much bigger event. We will formally set out our target for carbon neutrality, formally set out the way we will actually achieve that, and launch a 5-year plan in terms of what we will do to get there. Why a 5-year plan and not a 20-year plan? Because we want to make sure that the approach we take is based on technology and based on evidence, and we don't know what will exist in the future that we don't currently have. So what this means is that we can revise our approach every 5 years to make sure that we can achieve our targets as effectively as possible. The Springboard document talks about the 5 key areas in depth that we need to undertake all this work on, as well as what we're already working on: energy, buildings, transport, sustainable consumption, so waste, natural capital, so green spaces, trees, and importantly, there's a 6th work stream that we've now added: education, skills and engagement, because we have to work with people. People need to understand this agenda and the importance of it, and we have to make sure that people have the skills to thrive from this agenda. And the document ends by asking people to get involved. This is a partnership. The combined authority can't do this on its own. Individual councils and collectively we can't do this on our own. People, this is about people. It's about Greater Manchester, not about the combined authority. We're asking people to work in partnership with us and to continue making pledges such as those which were launched at the Green Summit. Business and individuals, tell us what you're doing to help us with our agenda and make sure this goes as far as possible. Finally, I want to thank all officers of the Combined Authority who've worked very, very hard on this document and the work around it, as well as our partners. Special mention to the Green Summit Steering Group, who've worked very, very closely with us to get us to this final version. And a special mention for Mark Atherton, the Environment Director at the Combined Authority. None of this would have been possible without his expertise and his diligence and his commitment to what we are doing. So I'm very happy to take any questions or comments on the report.
Thank you very much indeed, Alex. Councillor Brenda Warrington.
Thank you, Chair. Well, first of all, can I say that on behalf of Tameside, I welcome this report, and to advise that Tameside, on the strength of the summit that's already been held and the one that's going to be held next year, we have actually agreed now to hold our own mini Green Summit within Tameside, and you know we will very much hope to invite Alex to come and talk at that summit. But it is something that I'm very, very keen on as well, and we are getting lots of interest. But really, what I wanted to advise the Combined Authority was something that's not really been a factor of the report, but I think is important, and it relates to the Greater Manchester Pension Fund. And as chair of that fund, I thought it useful to make the Combined Authority very much aware that, for one, both during and since the Green Summit, I and other members of the fund have been lobbied mercilessly, I have to say, and I understand that, relative obviously to the investment policy of the fund. And what I do want to advise is that we're very, very obviously keen to make sure that the fund is a responsible investor. And since the summit, we've actually received a letter from Mary Cray MP, who is the chair of the Environmental Audit Committee. And she advised us on the 25th of May that she'd published our response to her committee, basically relative to the steps that the pension fund is taking to manage those risks that climate change obviously poses to UK pension investments. And more so, it was very satisfying actually to hear that the fund was stated to have reached the highest standard of being more engaged. Our commitment to report on climate change risks and opportunities that face our funds have been recognised, and that is in line with the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And on the 5th of June this year, the fund has been recognised as being a Transition Pathway Initiative supporter. That means that we're committed to the transition to a low-carbon economy, supporting every effort to address climate change. And this year's annual report actually does now include a section on the pension fund's approach to climate risk. And we definitely wholeheartedly support those recommendations of the Financial Stability Board's task force on climate-related financial disclosures. We know that financial decarbonisation of the economy is very complex and very challenging, particularly for long-term investors such as pension funds. But that's not stopped us to committing to the Paris Agreement, and we will look to be compatible with the net zero emissions ambition by 2050. And progress towards this goal will be regularly evaluated, very much in line with our objective of maintaining long-term financial performance, because at the end of the day, there are thousands and thousands of people expect to receive a decent pension from this pension fund as well. And we do stand by the belief, and we believe over 80% of our stakeholders agree with this, that a consultative approach is going to be much more effective than divesting our holdings immediately and passing the buck to other potential investors who may not be, quite frankly, as responsible as we know we are. We will continue to use our position on the Local Authority Pension Fund Forum to engage with and to challenge those companies in which we have an interest. So I do want to make sure that that assurance is tabled today. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Brenda. Quite a few members of that fund, I think, in this room, so they were listening very intently as you were giving your report. But you are right, the same questions have been asked of me as well, and I'm sure Alex will very much welcome what you've just said. I certainly do. It's very good to hear that the Environmental Audit Committee recognise the engaged status of the fund in looking at its investments, and we're very pleased that you're taking such a focus on that, Brenda, so thank you very much, Alex.
Thanks. First of all, Councillor Robinson, I've already accepted your invitation to speak at the Tameside Green Summit. Yeah. Secondly, on the pension fund, clearly pension funds have an overriding fiduciary duty to its members to get the best financial returns. But I very much welcome what the Greater Manchester Pension Fund has been saying and their revised approaches to low carbon investments and approaches to that. But the wider point I would make is actually our agenda is about investing in growth sectors, investing in energy networks of the future that will be sustainable, buildings, enabling people to get more for less in terms of energy efficient buildings, new ways of construction, robust and sustainable transport facilities for the future that will both serve the economic needs of Greater Manchester as well as reducing carbon, getting traffic, getting cars off the road. So I think that for investment vehicles and especially pension funds, this really should be absolutely aligned with where they need to go in order to make those effective long-term investments for its members, and it's clear from what you say that the Greater Manchester Pension Fund is absolutely on board with those points, and I look forward to that partnership working in the coming years.
Dennett?
Yeah, I welcome this report. I think it's absolutely a fantastic piece of work, and I welcome the fact that it's taken a science and evidence-based approach, but also been very engaging in terms of residents and stakeholders across Greater Manchester. I guess for me, though, I guess the challenge is that we don't see this work in isolation, because clearly there are links with all of the portfolios within the combined authority. I mean, we've been talking earlier about local industrial strategy and how the government sees clean growth as one of the grand challenges. Well, clean growth is clearly this agenda. And then also, you know, post-Brexit, the Shared Prosperity Fund, in terms of articulating our aspirations. This is our aspirations for a cleaner, greener economy here within Greater Manchester. I welcome the 5-year plan because I guess one of my frustrations has been with this agenda is there's an awful lot of great activity going on across Greater Manchester, and we see the green economy as critical to the Greater Manchester economy. But I guess the challenge has always been, how do we scale this up across Greater Manchester and how do we collaborate around this agenda? Really pleased to hear the importance of education, skills and training in all of this, because for me, to get that cultural shift, this is about carbon literacy, this is about education, this is about bringing people on that journey with us. Certainly from my perspective on planning, there's a clear read-through here in terms of zero carbon homes, but also that relationship with health and housing is really important. We've already heard about the importance of temporary accommodation. And when I look at some of the challenges that are outlined within the report, you know, a massive increase in photovoltaics, retrofitting of at least 60% of our homes, a shift to electric heat pumps rather than gas boilers, and a shift to zero emissions transport. These are significant challenges and they will require significant levels of investment and finance, and I hope that the 5-year plan goes some way towards trying to address some of these financial issues really here, so we move from the kind of pepper-potted great initiatives in parts of Greater Manchester to a real GM approach to really tackling carbon and climate change and embedding that within our industrial strategy and what we're trying to achieve as an economy. But you know, I really welcome the work that's been done here. I also think there's another area as well that we probably need to give some thought to, and that is changes within the construction industry, the emergence of modular construction, and how does this agenda play out in that. So, you know, really welcome this, but I guess for me, I'm really looking forward to this 5-year plan to get stuck into operationalising this across Greater Manchester.
Thanks very much, Paul. Any other colleagues? Just to summarise and pick up the point Paul was making, it would be wrong to see this as a peripheral agenda, a good thing to do, but you know, something that we just give fleeting attention to. There are two big forces at play in the 21st century economy: decarbonisation and digitalisation. We're going to come on to talk about full fibre in a moment, but it's absolutely at the heart of my strategy as Mayor of Greater Manchester to make Greater Manchester a leader in both green and digital, because that is the future of the economy. And if we are in a leadership position on those issues, we will gain many benefits. For instance, our young people will be trained in the skills around retrofitting properties that Paul just mentioned, and therefore they will have skills that can be taken across the country and indeed across the world. So this is central to our story going forward, indeed to the industrial strategy, as Sir Richard Lee's said. So I would welcome the engagement of all colleagues behind the work that Alex and Mark and the team at the GMCA are doing. It was good to hear, Brenda, that Tameside are planning their own mini summit to pick up the work. Obviously I would encourage others to do the same. It's just important for people to see how central this is to everything that we're doing, because if the clean growth strand of the industrial strategy is to have any meaning, it will be coming through the work that's being done through the Green Summit Springboard and the work streams that Alex has announced. So congratulations, Alex, excellent work, and I think this is something that needs to continue to move towards the centre stage of thinking in Greater Manchester. Moving on to digital, item 17, full fibre programme update. Councillor Andrew Weston.
Thank you, and I'm really pleased to be presenting this report today, because although it is only an update report, it really is good news for Greater Manchester, as it sets out just how close we are to securing almost £25 million of funding for full fibre connectivity rollout across the conurbation. Colleagues will be aware that in January the CA agreed to proceed to bid to secure DDCMS funding for the rollout of full fibre broadband, and we have now secured that agreement for £23.8 million of funding, and this report confirms the site numbers and capital allocations so that we can proceed to secure a conditional grant offer letter by the end of July. Just to make colleagues aware of the scope and ambition of this agenda, we are looking to connect up with full fibre 1,500 public sector buildings across Greater Manchester. We hope that that will act as a catalyst for businesses to follow suit. At present, in the conurbation, we have around 2% full fibre connectivity, and this programme will allow us to reach around a 25% level by the end of 2020 to realise our ambitions to be a world-leading digital city region. This is something that simply has to happen. To put the 25% figure into context, whilst our current figure of around 2% is in line broadly with the rest of the country, many of our European colleagues have much better full fibre connectivity. For instance, in Spain and Portugal, this is 60%. So if we are serious, as you've just said yourself, Mayor Burnham, about being a digital city region and making digitisation a priority, this is something that I think absolutely has to happen. Just a brief note around the local element of financing. The capital allocations, as I said, are set out in the report, but just to be clear for colleagues that this will not require any additional funding. It will simply be the capitalisation of anticipated revenue spend over the next 20 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. There is more information set out in the item under Part B, but unless anybody wants to raise anything to do with this item under Part B, I suggest we take the whole thing now. Any questions or comments to Andrew? If not, it just represents solid progress. And for those who think we're probably having too many summits in Greater Manchester, the Digital Summit, I think, put us in a position where we won the bid from DD-CMS because we did that thinking needed around digital infrastructure in GM, and we were ready to go. And I think that this is the result of having started to do that more detailed work. So it's excellent progress. Of course, this will present opportunities to the private sector in all 10 of our boroughs to piggyback on the investment that's going into full fibre to public premises. And I think we need to bring forward further thinking about how that is maximised so that we get take up as much as possible. But this is really good progress. Thank you to you, Andrew. Do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, just to recognise, following on from what you said, the work that has been done prior to my appointment to this portfolio role, both by my immediate predecessor Sean Anstey and I believe Richard Farnell. Before that, I obviously wasn't a part of the Digital Summit, but it's fair to say that this is a significant piece of work that's been going on for a long period, and in particular to place on record my thanks to Phil Swan and the team within the CA who've done an enormous amount of work on this.
Most unusual for a politician not claiming all the glory when you were being handed it there, but yes, rightly praising Sean and Richard and others who've helped. So, colleagues, can I ask for your agreement to these proposals? Thank you very much. Item 18, Northern and Transpennine Rail Performance Update. Colleagues will have the paper that sets out the performance, and the main point to make when looking at the figures is, frankly, what I find a kind of astonishing finding, that the emergency timetable hasn't improved service standards, and passengers across Greater Manchester and indeed the north as a whole are continuing to have to put up with an unacceptably poor level of service. In relation to Northern, you can see that the latest periodic PPM, the punctuality data, shows a decline to 77%. It shows over 1,000 full or part cancellations. It also reveals a growing trend towards the short forming of trains. Colleagues from across Greater Manchester will be receiving reports of large numbers of people on platforms, heavily congested platforms, people unable to get on overcrowded trains. Here you have the reason why, because there has been an increase in short forming of trains. Looking at TransPennine, I'm afraid the picture is not much better. We're looking there at a PPM figure, punctuality figure of 71%, according to the most recent figures. This was 91% last year, just to put that in context. It points to a more fundamental problem on our railways than simply confusion around the introduction of the change of the timetable. I think what these figures are telling us is that there is something seriously wrong here with the industry's understanding of the pattern of services on the system, the congestion in certain parts of the system, and it points to significant failure on behalf of all parts of the rail industry to both diagnose these problems, find solutions to them, and then ensure an acceptable standard of service to the Greater Manchester public. This is simply not good enough. The Transport Secretary said a couple of months ago that sorting out rail services in the north was his top priority. Well, I see no evidence that he has made it his top priority since he made that public statement. And he needs to show now that it is his top priority. He needs to come here, sit down and work these issues out. It's simply not good enough for people to have to put up with these poor services on a daily basis. We had a discussion at the Mayoral Transport Board last week, myself together with Sir Richard, and I'm afraid to say the industry wasn't able to give any satisfactory answers as to why this poor performance is continuing. It is clear there are capacity problems in the Castlefield, Oxford Road, Piccadilly area, but we knew that, and that's why there were upgrades planned for that corridor that were postponed by the Transport Secretary almost exactly a year ago to this day. It all is not good enough at all. The travelling public of the North and Greater Manchester deserve a lot better than this, and we shouldn't and we mustn't put up with it. We need to get louder on their behalf, and I can assure colleagues that at the meeting of the Transport for the North Board next week I will be making the same points very forcibly. Sir Richard.
Thanks, Chair. As you said at the Mayor's Transport Board recently, that we got a lot of vagueness out of both the operators and Network Rail, but one thing that did emerge in the discussion, which was certainly new to me, is that the position of the Castlefield corridor. And the Northern Hub work was supposed to have had three major elements to it. One of those has been completed, which is the Ordsall Chord. The other two, which is the ability of Oxford Road Station to have the longer platforms in order to take longer trains. It's not only not been completed, it's not been started. And similarly, the proposal to extend Piccadilly Station by adding platform 15 and 16. So actually, I think the results of the public inquiry have now been sat on ministerial desks for over 2 years for both Oxford Road and for Piccadilly 15-16. And the Secretary of State was saying a year ago that the reason for that is they were evaluating whether or not they needed 15-16 because it would be self-evidently a very expensive piece of work. What came out of the discussion at the Transport Board was that as part of the May timetable, they had been attempting to run the 15 trains an hour lot through the Castlefield corridor that were required by that timetable, but for which the work at Oxford Road and Piccadilly was necessary to make it work. And the fact that they ran 15 trains and they couldn't work, I think is pretty clearly demonstrated that we do need platform 15 and 16. So I think probably you and I, as on behalf of the City and the Combined Authority, I think should be writing to the Secretary of State. He identified this as a priority a year ago in a public meeting at Transport for the North, saying that we can't wait for progress anymore, that the timetable is not deliverable unless work is done to free up Oxford Road and Piccadilly Station, and that we need a resolution to the current impasse as soon as possible.
I think the point that you've just made, Richard, contradicts the Transport Secretary's claim that he bears no responsibility for the continuing chaos on our railways. while that report has been sitting there for those 2 years, as you described, it would seem a cheque for £600 million for Crossrail cost overruns was very readily offered up only this week, and it does suggest that there are differential standards being applied to transport in London and the south than to transport in the north. Councillor Andrew Weston.
Yes, thank you. And just to agree very much with what you yourself said, Andy, you know, there has been no improvement of service, and it's a nonsense to suggest that there has been. For all of their assurances, Northern Rail are still failing the residents of Greater Manchester and the wider north. At our full council meeting in Trafford on Wednesday night, we moved a motion condemning the performance of Northern Rail and Chris Grayling, and our Conservative group responded by suggesting that this was a May-only problem. I smiled and nodded, assuming that they meant Theresa May, but sadly they were actually claiming that this was a problem that had been left behind 2 months ago. That is absolute nonsense, and in that motion we have called for the resignation of Chris Grayling and the cancellation of the franchise that Northern Rail holds. That is our position. I will be writing to the Prime Minister in the next few days to set that out clearly, and I just think that this is unacceptable and that the government cannot continue to treat the commuters of the north with the contempt that they have in ignoring this issue for so long.
Thanks, Andrew. Councillor David Molyneux, Leader of Wigan Council.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I think it's unacceptable, isn't it? Let's be honest about it. No matter what nice words we say about this, it doesn't get any better. And you just have to start looking at Northern's performance. And then I start looking at the services that affect people of Wigan. And I look at Merseyrail and the number of cancellations along that line, which certainly affect commuters in Wigan. Can I ask that when you and Richard send this letter, that we all sign it on behalf of all the combined authority, and all 10 leaders sign the letter, because this service affects us all, and it's such poor in its delivery. And I've said before, it's worse than a third world service on many occasions. And I sat on a train that was stopped just outside of Oxford Road Station for something like 40 minutes the other day. It's not a pleasant experience, to say the least, especially when it's packed. So we can't keep putting up and accepting the service that these people purport to give us. Let us all get behind it, let us all sign the letter, and let's make sure if other authorities in and around the north want to sign it, let them sign it too, and let's give them what for, please.
You, David. Councillor Brenda Warrington.
Thanks, Andy. Like I'm sure many people in this room, I'm genuinely alarmed at this report. I really am alarmed. And when we consider, we've just heard a really good report about, Green Summit, green issues from Councillor Gwyn and what we need to do. And let's be honest about it, an efficient rail service is absolutely fundamental to us being able to persuade generally the public to ditch their car and start to use public transport as an alternative. The air quality in Greater Manchester, we all know, is dangerous, it's toxic, and in many places, highly toxic. And we have to address this. And public transport and an efficient transport system is fundamental, as I said. I am absolutely appalled that the Minister of State is hiding away these days. He's not seeming to be prepared to even consider the problems that we're facing. And I've also experienced the inefficient service of Northern Rail, and I would be more than prepared, on behalf of Tameside, to sign any such letter to that effect, that we take away that franchise from Northern Rail and we really do seek that resignation, as has been suggested, of the Secretary of State. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. Councillor Gwyn.
Thank you. Just building on Councillor Warrington's point there in terms of future growth. In Stockport, we're currently consulting on on a refresh of the South East Manchester multimodal strategy to come up with a new strategy that will be fit for purpose for the next 20 years in terms of transport across Stockport. And as part of that, we've been doing a number of public consultation exercises. And given that those consultations have run basically at the same time as this debate, it's been raised by residents over and over again at those meetings we've been having with them about the frustration that they have with local rail services, especially given our consultation on SEMS, which is putting great onus on the rail network to deal with capacity issues, relieve congestion on our roads, and be able to deal with growth in commuting and population numbers over the next 20 years. We're going to become ever more reliant, or should need to be more reliant, on rail. And as a council, we need to be able to build confidence of the travelling public that rail is a viable alternative to the car, and that rail is something that's reliable and will improve. And I'm afraid we're not in a very good position as things stand there. Secondly, this report does talk about improvements to Sunday services, and I think we should continue to pursue that, even if other franchise commitments are challenging to deliver, because I think Sunday services are becoming more important with people having different working patterns and than was previously the case. It's become a much more important day economically, therefore. People also want to rely on the trains much more for leisure. So we absolutely need to make sure that Sunday services remain at the top of our agenda. And when we've previously discussed this in the combined authority, we've talked about how each partner is blaming each other in terms of this. Northern Rail blaming Network Rail and vice versa. The government blaming rail operators. The rail operators blaming the government. In terms of Northern Rail, I will say one thing that I think is a fact, and that is that I think they've engaged terribly with key stakeholders over all of this, most notably councils and TFGM. We are their key stakeholders, I would say, in Greater Manchester, and they've been absolutely shocking at stakeholder engagement. So they tell us now about the tight constraints that were put on them by Network Rail after Christmas, and the concertinaing of the process needed to come up with a new timetable. And why that was so difficult for them, and why they had no other options, and they're very sorry about this. It doesn't excuse the fact that we've basically found all of this out after May. Why couldn't they have told us about this before May? The fact is they had several months when they knew what was going to happen after May. They may not have known exactly what was going to happen, but they knew there was a problem, and there was no openness, very little honesty about Northern Rail, and a complete disrespect, not just of the public, but of key stakeholders such as councils. I mean, we could have helped, couldn't we? We could have lobbied on this issue. We could have raised awareness of what was likely to happen if things didn't change. We could have put pressure on the government. But we couldn't fulfil our roles as key stakeholders because of the approach that Northern Rail took. And whatever happens with these services, whatever happens with the timetable, I want the way that Northern Rail engages with its stakeholders and the attitude that it takes to change right now, because that is inexcusable and they can't blame that on anyone else.
Well, I couldn't agree more, and we've had news while this combined authority has been meeting that the Office of the Rail Regulator has intervened with respect to Network Rail, but it feels late, to say the least, given that this chaos has been ongoing for some considerable time, and I think you speak, Alex, for how most commuters feel in Greater Manchester. Mayor Dennett?
Yeah, I think looking at the report, we need to remind ourselves that the residents of Greater Manchester really have been underserved by Northern for over 2 years, actually. So if you look at the public performance measure between April 2016 and June 2018, Northern has failed to meet those measures since June 2016. You know, that's an absolute disgrace. There hasn't been improvements in capacity and customer experience over that period of time. This is not a new issue. Northern has fundamentally failed the people of Greater Manchester. And then when you read the report and look at the detail in there, you know, look at all the issues: trains blocking platforms, signalling issues, train fleet infrastructure failures, delays, poor workforce planning, cancellations, Health and safety issues, crowding on platforms and trains, short forming, especially impacting North Manchester. And then, you know, when you think about the relationship between transport infrastructure and what we're trying to do on the Green Summit, but also what we're trying to do economically, you know, and the government say they're committed to rebalancing the economy, they say they're committed to the Northern Powerhouse. Well, I don't see very much commitment here on transport and the absolute importance of transport in terms of social mobility and driving economic growth within places like Greater Manchester. For me, it's clear that the Secretary of State needs to take a sense of ownership of this rather than pointing the blame and displacing responsibility and saying, over to you, industry. This is actually about the government stepping in for what has been a problem for over 2 years that has horrifically impacted the lives of people here in Greater Manchester. And we need change now, and I fully endorse a joint letter to the Secretary of State on this issue. Thank you.
You mentioned workforce planning. It just reminded me that we're used in this country to a long list of famous excuses for not being able to run a rail service. There was the, what was it, leaves on the line, wrong type of snow. There was the new one recently of England were nearly in a World Cup final, and as a result we don't have enough staff, which was a new one actually, and I think it adds to the kind of indistinguished list of rail excuses. Lord Peter Smith.
We just need to remind ourselves that this region was the first passenger rail service in the world. 180 years ago we could manage to run passenger trains, and we can't now. And I wonder, in addition to the Secretary of State, we should write to Michael Portillo and ask him to come on one of his great rail journeys across Greater Manchester, but tell him it may take him quite some time.
Absolutely. Thank you, colleagues, for your contributions. I think to pick up Councillor Molyneux's point, these rail companies can't be allowed to inflict their miserable services on the public of Greater Manchester on an ongoing basis. Enough is enough. Sir Richard Lee suggested the letter. I think the point about Castlefield is that it's the bottleneck that affects everybody. So if there are problems there, it does affect every borough in Greater Manchester. And I think actually Sir Richard's got closest to putting his finger on the problem that the rail industry somehow has been unable to find, and that is too many services are going through that corridor when they haven't done the improvements that they recognise were needed should that extra traffic to be going through. It's pretty simple, it would seem. So I think we do need to write that joint letter. So I'll propose to the Combined Authority that we draft that and circulate it early next week and send the clearest of messages that we need the Transport Secretary to make good on his commitment to make sorting out rail services in the north his top priority, because quite frankly he's failed to do that so far. Councillor Mark Aldred.
I just wondered if it was possible to include our GM MPs as well in that, because a lot of them have been down to London recently. They're all seeing Network Rail individually, and I just think it would be better also to come from a unified background.
Thank you, Mark. We'll take that suggestion away. Maybe not all, but we'll take that away and see if we can get the maximum level of backing for what we're saying. Okay, colleagues, thank you very much for your comments. We now have 4 items related to transport that are actually a bit happier than the one we've just been through. Item 19 is the process of bus reform, and what we're asking the Combined Authority to agree today is to put in place the procedural requirement to have an auditor to consider the assessment that is being made of our options under the Bus Services Act 2017. This is about keeping momentum in the whole process of bus reform. This isn't a substantive decision, it's simply a requirement to ensure that we are moving as quickly as possible. So unless colleagues want a longer discussion on this, I propose that we agree this today and encourage TFGM to continue the work that it's doing. Is that agreed, colleagues? Thank you very much. Item 20, Mayor's Cycling and Walking Challenge Fund. We had a presentation from Chris Boardman, our Cycling and Walking Commissioner at the last Combined Authority in Trafford, where he presented to us the B-Lines concept, which it's fair to say was very well received, very warmly received, as it has been by the Greater Manchester public. This is truly innovative thinking. And as Peter Smith was saying before, we do have to get people moving, we do have to give genuine alternatives to the car, and we need to improve the infrastructure in all of our boroughs. So what you have before you is the first list of schemes coming forward under the B-Lines programme. These are 15 schemes, one of which I believe is in every borough, but some get more than one, but we will even things up as we go along. More schemes are coming forward here than we originally anticipated, and consequently when we look at the capital budget in a moment, that will be reflected there in the change that needs to be made. But I'm keen to get on with the job of making these improvements across Greater Manchester, and I hope colleagues will endorse this report today, because it genuinely does offer something for everyone, and these are transport improvements that, unlike our railways, might bear fruit within a matter of years and possibly even months. So colleagues, have we got your approval for this report? Councillor Warrington?
Happy to approve, Chair. That's not. I just wondered whether on the scheme names, whether we could just have the borough that it relates to. I'm not too sure. It just names streets, you see, and I'm not too sure just where some of them are.
I'm certain we can provide that extra information. I'm sure John and the team will take that on board. There is a table, Brenda. 2 point. Yeah. So, colleagues, this is to approve the first tranche of schemes. It's also to release funding of 1.5 million to manage the programme, and also make some capital revenue switches to support that, and also to release 1.5 million for scheme development and design. Are we content? Thank you very much. Moving on to item 21. This is another important step in the evolution of Greater Manchester's transport system towards a more integrated, connected system. The notion of a zonal system to support Metrolink obviously mirrors the situation that has been in place in London for many years, and I see this as a kind of foundation really for how we might build an integrated transport system on top of this Metrolink map. So it's good as far as it goes with regard to Metrolink, but it will also enable us to place a reformed bus system on top of this Metrolink network. The B-Lines too will play into this network, and we will build this picture over the years as we make improvements to our transport system. What this means for the travelling public, we've already agreed as a combined authority to increase fares as of next January. That isn't affected by this, that those increases are coming as they have already been agreed. This is about the principle of offering the GM public a slightly different offer when it comes to Metrolink. So rather than doing point-to-point journeys and using ticketing to support that approach, it's about giving people more freedom to travel across an entire zone. So it will give people more flexibility and more for their money when it comes to the use of Metrolink. I did ask TFGM to go out to a short period of public consultation, because we recognise that there may be some communities that may have particular views on the way the map was configured. To summarise, broadly, the Greater Manchester public were happy with what was being proposed. there was a concern about value for money, but I think that was perhaps misunderstanding the fact that the fare increase had already been agreed, and that wasn't part of what was being proposed here. Concerns were raised by Bury Council and by colleagues in Oldham. There has been a change made in respect of the map in the Whitefield area at the request of Bury Council. No change has been made in Oldham, because I think the concerns raised have been, I hope, satisfactorily answered. So what we have here, colleagues, is a zonal Metrolink map, which I think does take the Greater Manchester Transport System on a stage. I'd like to congratulate TFGM and their colleagues for the speed with which this has been done. We've talked about this for many years, but actually they've now done it, and I know the team have worked very hard on this, some of them at the back of the room today. Thank you, colleagues. It's important to say that this won't be the only change coming through onto Metrolink in the new year. The proposal is to introduce this from January, and around the same time we are looking to introduce contactless payment on Metrolink. Around the same time, I said, John. So don't that can mean many things, but we are hoping that to be done as early in the new year as we can manage. So, I want to recommend that to the combined authority, unless anybody wants to come in and raise any points. Councillor Sean Fielding.
Thanks, Chair. I do want to speak, because even though we didn't get the change that we wanted in Oldham, I don't want anybody to think that I'm sulking about it or anything. I suppose I really do welcome the change to zonal fares on the Metrolink. The tram system offers something that we lost when the bus services were deregulated, in the way that it provides cross-city connectivity that very few other modes of transport do, and certainly from a point of view of Oldham, where we only actually have one railway station in the borough that takes us into Manchester and not very far beyond anyway. It really adds value, and this zonal system means that it will become more affordable for people to travel across the city centre from Oldham. So going into South Manchester, relative to where the fares are at the moment, it will actually be cheaper. And that has massive implications for people that want to access the employment opportunities that are being created at the airport and at Trafford Park, and that we know exist in South Manchester. So I do welcome the change to zonal fares on the Metrolink, and hope that we can build on it when we get the degree of control over the bus network, which is still being discussed.
Thank you very much indeed, Sean. You're absolutely right. This gives people much better value for money, and is to be welcomed as such. Thank you, colleagues. That looks like that is agreed. So, John, I hope that you and the TFGM team can now get on and make this change with effect from the new year. Item 22, in a similar vein, coordinating taxis and private hire licensing in Greater Manchester. Again, this is about standardising what we do and raising the quality of our approach to all forms of public transport in Greater Manchester, and we need to consider taxis and private hire in that vein as well. We've reached in principle agreement to begin a consultation on whether or not minimum standards should be developed across Greater Manchester with respect to private hire and taxis. Of course, this could be in the area of driver background checks, training, knowledge of the local area. It could relate to the age of the vehicle and the quality of the vehicle, emissions, and whether or not we wish to move to an electric private hire and taxi fleet. It could also relate to the livery and whether or not Greater Manchester wishes to move to a standard livery. Visitors to cities around the world will often note the taxi service is very visible, and that gives confidence to new arrivals in cities around the world. Again, this reform could help achieve that and give the Greater Manchester public more clarity that if they are stepping into a vehicle anywhere in Greater Manchester, a taxi vehicle or a private hire vehicle, they know what they can expect. This isn't to propose, it's important to say, a Greater Manchester plate. No one is talking about TFGM taking over the licensing of vehicles from individual councils. This is about the 10 councils voluntarily agreeing the same minimum standards and then all licensing to those standards using local plates, but still having hopefully the same end result. The scheme rests, though, I believe, on the need for legislative reform at a national level. We currently have in place a deregulation proposal that allows any vehicle licensed anywhere to work anywhere. So colleagues will see around Greater Manchester a preponderance of vehicles licensed in Wolverhampton, Sefton, in the past Rossendale, although it seems to be less of a problem these days. And these are perceived to be authorities that apply lighter checks, lower charges as a result, but consequently result in poorer standard regulation. The existence of that deregulatory provision means that effectively the taxi industry is a race to the bottom. It's the lowest common denominator which sets the standard in the industry. And we believe here in Greater Manchester it should be the opposite. We want to work with our taxi industry to raise standards, not lower them. And of course we want to promote and protect our own drivers who live and work within Greater Manchester and not allow them to be undercut from outside. We want to have some degree of control over the number of vehicles on our roads in line with our ambitions to cut congestion. So there are a lot of reasons why it makes sense to move in this direction, not least the air quality issues that Alex raised before. We have to agree an air quality plan with the government by the end of this year, and all elements of public transport will need to make their contribution to cleaning up the air of Greater Manchester. It is not acceptable that children in the poorest areas of Greater Manchester are breathing in the most polluted air. And that means that buses, taxis and other forms of transport will need to make changes. With regard to taxis, I think we should be seeing how we might help our taxi drivers move to more clean vehicles, possibly through loan finance or other measures we might introduce. And of course, we could phase some of the proposals that we may come up with to allow small business owners, self-employed taxi drivers, to manage any proposals for change. But colleagues, what I'm recommending to you today is the beginning of a consultation, a conversation about taxi reform in Greater Manchester. I met with the trade last night, or some representatives of the Greater Manchester taxi and private hire trade, to begin this conversation with them at your request, because leaders asked for that to be done, which it has been. We've agreed to set up a trade reference group to support this conversation about reform, but we think Greater Manchester is now ready to move in this direction, subject to the government agreeing to our request to scrap the deregulation proposal around out-of-area working. That's the package. I hope it makes sense. I'd like to recommend it to the combined authority today so that this conversation can begin in earnest. I'd like to open the floor to colleagues. Alex Ganotis.
Thanks. Well, you touched on it there, but this does relate to my green portfolio as well, because I think that taxis have a big role to play in the air quality agenda, as you set out. So when we're talking about age of vehicles and type of vehicles that we want from our taxi fleet, I think that this strategy will be really important. What I would just ask is that we ensure that officers that are leading the work on these new standards are coordinating with those officers working to develop that GM clean air plan, to make sure that we're fully aligned, and that the plan that we submit to government at the end of the year can take into account what we're working on in terms of taxis.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you. Just to say, Trafford are fully supportive of this stream of work. We're about to get underway with the soft engagement with our taxi trade in advance of the later full consultation stage. Clearly there'll be a level of concern from some within the trade, but there's a key message that all GM councils are signing up to this, and it's a consistent set of minimum standards. I think it's important to realise that where people want to go over and above that on specific issues at a borough level, they're entitled to do so. It's a minimum floor rather than set expectations. But just to talk about the importance of what this does in terms of us looking at what we're all doing collectively in Trafford a few years ago, the knowledge test for taxi drivers locally was scrapped. We've looked at what's done across Greater Manchester and realised actually that it's heavily in the public interest for that to be in there, and it's something that we're bringing back fairly shortly. So I think that we should really encourage the process of working together. Clearly, fully support the point around the beneficial aspects of this for both the green agenda and also for public safety, and really encouraged as well by what the report has to say about increasing pressure on the government surrounding regulatory reform, because there's a great deal of work that we can do in Greater Manchester, but ultimately if we're going to get on top of this properly, we do require some serious work from government to be undertaken to make sure that other authorities are in line. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Brenda Warrington.
Thanks, Chair. Fully agree with all of the comments made on ensuring that the vehicles themselves are of a standard that we would expect, you know, relative to air quality, etc. I also think it's very important that the credentials of the drivers applying for those licences are also seen to be having to go through the highest standards of need, because the safety of those passengers, particularly, well, no, all passengers, not particularly anyone, has really got to be paramount. We cannot have people that are getting licences from boroughs outside of Greater Manchester that are, you know, much more relaxed, let's say, than we would be, being able to come and put our passengers at risk. That is not acceptable, and I think that should be, frankly, a countrywide standard, but we've got to maybe set the scene. So it's important for the drivers as well as the vehicles to make sure that we have, you know, proper checks and balances. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brenda. Just to pick up on those points, it is a minimum floor that's been proposed, Andrew. So you know, that should hopefully provide some reassurance that boroughs will be free to add to that if they wish to. The truth of the matter is that taxis from all 10 boroughs work in all 10 boroughs. So you know, journeys crisscross Greater Manchester, they go to the airport from all 10 boroughs. So you know, there is a logic in applying the same standard. The truth of the matter is there is variation amongst the 10 at the moment, and this of course seeks to remove that so that the public know exactly what they are stepping into. On safety, Brenda, it is true that there have been people turned down for licences by Greater Manchester licensing authorities that have then gone outside, got a licence from somewhere else and come back and worked here. That isn't acceptable. That is undermining the standards of public safety that we wish to set for our own community. And I know the Deputy Mayor has strong views about the need to improve the safety of the nighttime economy, particularly for young women. And we have Sasha Lord, our nighttime economy advisor, who has got a clear interest in this issue, improving safety not just in taxis, but of course, as we know, on Metrolink there are issues that need to be addressed there around antisocial behaviour and serious disorder in and around Metrolink. And I met Councillor Fielding and others yesterday to discuss those issues. But this, I'm picking up that the Combined Authority wants to move in this direction. Obviously, lots of questions to be determined. But if you're content to accept the beginnings of this consultation, I suggest that we do that today and then get on with opening up this whole debate. Is that agreed? Thank you very much. Moving on to item 23, budget monitoring reports. Councillor David Molyneux.
Yeah, there are two reports, A and B. Nothing for concern, certainly at this time. I think some of the underspend on fire will be explained during Bev's process of going forward with the changes within the Fire Authority. So at this stage there's nothing to be concerned about, and both A and B I would expect you to accept, please, Mr Mayor.
Thank you very much, David. Any questions or issues arising that colleagues wish to raise? If not, thank you very much. Item 24, Greater Manchester Investment Framework Projects Update. Eamon, can I ask you to speak to this item?
Thank you, Chair. I think the report is self-explanatory. The application to provide a loan to Float Glass is fundamentally about protection of existing jobs in Wythenshawe, and the further loan to Black Dress Company is to support them and protect our existing investment as the company moves forward. I'm happy to try and take any questions.
There is further information included under Part B, but I hope we can take the whole of this item here. Sir Richard Lees.
Chair, I want to make a general comment on the back of this. And earlier this week we had the first meeting of the Greater Manchester Growth Board, and on that we had a paper that gave an overview of the investment funds that are held by the Combined Authority. And actually I think there is a remarkably good news story there, which is very hidden away. And I'll take the funds, the Regional Growth Fund, which is our biggest directly managed business fund. It's a fund of £65 million, of which we've currently spent £96.6 million, and we've still got £10.5 million left to allocate, which do the sums easily. So far we've spent about 170% of the fund, and we're still going. And that's because we, of course, established it as a recyclable fund. And we will be. And it is now a fund that was set up clearly through government money. The government now consider it's closed. We've overachieved all the targets we were set there, and that is now effectively has become Greater Manchester money through going through that recycling process. And we should be able to continue to spend it several more times over before we're done. The other fund, which has not quite the same percentage level of recycling so far, all of our funds do recycle, but one with quite a high level of recycling is the Housing Investment Fund, where early days there was some criticism of the approach to the Housing Investment Fund, but because of the approach that we've taken and the amount we've been able to recycle, we now have £60 million available for those more difficult schemes that we always wanted to be able to fund it in the first place. So we've found a way of being able to support investment both in housing and our economy that allows us to continue doing that over and over and over again, which I think is an exemplary model, and I suspect we're the only place in the country that is still spending Regional Growth Fund because of the approach that we've taken to it.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you for bringing those figures to our attention. I think it might be good at some point to have a stock take on both of those investment funds, so that we can tell that story that you've just outlined more effectively, because obviously we have let those early more commercial loans to build the war chest, if you like, that allows us then to do other things that have more social purposes. So it's a credit to Eamon, the team in the growth company, and you know, I think it's something we should absolutely be celebrating. No further comments or questions to Eamon? If not, thank you, Eamon. That's agreed. Moving on to the Greater Manchester Housing Investment Fund. Again, there's more information in Part B. I propose that we take the whole item now, unless anybody thinks otherwise. Mayor Dennett. Oh, there is one adjustment, I think.
There is. Do you want me to? I can cover that. That's fine. So there's 5 submissions, but we are going to be withdrawing the RP joint venture submission because that is a request for equity. It's not a loan arrangement. So further work needs to be done, and we'll bring that back to the Combined Authority at an appropriate time. Just to go through the 4 applications for the GM Investment Loans Fund this month. So the first one is Bowden Homes, which is Tameside scheme, a request for £5.410 million for 34 homes. Planning permission has already been granted, and it is to support a small medium enterprise developer to build family housing. There is also a Section 106 agreement with this of £90,000, and that's for the purposes of green space and education. The second submission is Brunswick Living Limited. That's a Manchester scheme. That's a request for £2.088 million to build 16 apartments. Again, planning permission has already been granted for that. The third scheme is Slate Acre Partnership Limited. Again, a Tameside scheme for a request for £1.916 million, and that's 10 houses. Planning permission's been granted, and that also does include a Section 106 agreement, and it is to support a small medium enterprise developer. The fourth scheme is HS Property Group, which is a Greater Manchester initiative, and this is a request for £1 million for a revolving credit facility to purchase derelict and vacant properties to support, if you like, the city region with temporary accommodation and how we meet some of our homelessness challenges. Also, this will support the Compass contract with the Home Office in terms of how we house asylum seekers and refugees within the city region. Those are the four schemes. So if obviously the loans are entered into today, it will take the combined authority agreements on loans from £421.2 million to £431.6 million. Just draw attention to the recommendations. So to approve the GM Housing Investment Loans Fund in the table below, obviously removing the fifth one, as we've already discussed, and then to delegate authority to the GM Treasurer acting in conjunction with the Monitoring Officer to prepare the necessary legal agreements. There is also a third bullet point, because obviously you'll be aware we've not got a combined authority in the month of August, so we are requesting to delegate authority from the 30th of July 2018 to the 27th of September 2018 to the Chief Exec and the Treasurer, in consultation with myself if any further requests for projects come forward. Obviously this is still subject to due diligence, and we will be reporting any agreements back to the combined authority at the appropriate time. So those are the recommendations before members of the CA today. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. And the projects that you've just read out, particularly the last one, I think provide proof of the point Sir Richard Lees was just making, that we are able now through the Housing Investment Scheme to direct funding towards schemes with a more direct social purpose, and that is always the direction that we've wanted to move. So thank you to you for bringing this forward. Colleagues want to raise any issues on these schemes? Two in Tameside, Brenda? Doing well. If not, is that agreed? Thank you very much. We do actually have to move though into Part B today, because we have to consider an item related to waste disposal, contract and pension arrangements for contractor staff. So I will have to ask our colleagues from the press and any members of the public to leave us